If you've been paying any attention to the media in the past few weeks, you've almost certainly been bombarded with at least one story like these.
There are more than 100 Chinese government-backed overseas police stations operating in more than 50 sovereign nations right now, including the United States and Canada.
Well, China uses every point of contact with the United States to destroy our society. And of course, business is one of those primary contacts. And we just need to cut those ties.
Anger and frustration boiling over against the government's strict zero COVID lockdowns.
TikTok privacy concerns to the Chinese spy balloon.
The Chinese try to beat the U.S. in a new battlefield called near space. That is the area within 60 miles above the Earth's surface. And China wants to nominate it. And as we've seen from the spy balloon, maybe they are.
Yeah, that's a lot to go over. Let's see if someone summed that up any quicker.
The China spy balloon incident, U.S. warnings that China is considering arming Putin's army, the escalating standoffs about Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party possibly spying on Chinese dissidents here in the United States, competition over semiconductor manufacturing, concerns over data privacy and TikTok, not to mention renewed questions over COVID's origins. That's just some of the issues here.
And yeah, that is just some of the stories that the news has been talking about near constantly in the past few weeks. Now, what if I told you that all of these stories were intricately related for one specific reason that you didn't realize? On the surface, these stories would all point to rising tensions between the United States and China and portray a picture of a growing tide of aggression on behalf of China towards its neighbors and the US. While there is certainly a lot to be said about the worsening relations between the American and Chinese governments, there's something deeper going on here that explains why the American media is parading these specific stories about China.
Decoupling.
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 Decoupling. Decouple.
Decoupling.
Decoupling.
Decoupling you just did a minute ago. Decoupling China's economy with the U.S. economy.
That's right, decoupling. I believe this concept is the main reason why American media is taking such a vested interest in sounding the alarms over China right now. But if you're like me when I first heard this term, I'm sure you're asking yourself what decoupling even means. What these stories are referring to, more specifically, is economically decoupling with China. Decoupling is an umbrella term, essentially a catchy buzzword for multiple different economic possibilities. What decoupling could mean depends on who you ask, but the main manifestations could be disincentivizing or mandating a split from trade with China in key product areas, removing American investments in China, or even cutting trade as a whole in some more extreme proposals. Decoupling acts as a sort of unofficial sanctioning in that it accomplishes the same goals but doesn't carry with it the sort of official state denunciation that a typical sanction would, and that denunciation's subsequent political fallout. I'm sure you're wondering by this point how exactly this would affect you. Well, rest assured, this would have a global impact on trade, especially in the US and its geopolitical allies. If you were living in one of these countries, especially the United States, this move could have severe ramifications on your livelihood. Given this, I think it warrants explaining who exactly has stake in this push for divestment and decoupling. In order to explain who would most benefit from this, it's important for you to understand just how deeply the American and Chinese economies are tied. First off, according to US government statistics, China is America's #1 goods trading partner, with about $560 billion in total trade in 2020. Most relevant to this discussion is that almost $435 billion of this total trade was from Chinese imports into the United States. One of the main talking points in the American media about this issue is related to the trade deficit. The US goods trade deficit with China in 2020 was about $310 billion, and the media absolutely loves to point this out as a leading example of imbalance in US-China trade. This is, of course, the natural economic result of the dynamic between the two countries and isn't something that's been forced on the US by anyone other than its own corporations, but I digress. This trade deficit and constant allegations that Chinese products, especially software such as TikTok, are subversive tools of the Chinese state is used to argue that the US needs to put the brakes on its economic ties to China. There's a larger argument rooted in this suspicion that says our economic and social reliance on goods produced in China make the US susceptible to the whims of the Chinese government, putting them in an inordinate position of power over America, which could lead to some rug pull in the future when they hope to become the leading world power. Now, it should be obvious that this is all conjecture and largely ignores the reality of both China's diplomatic practices and their geopolitical goals. From the examples that exist, though, China leads its diplomacy in a much less confrontational manner than the media portrays. And frankly, the reality of US-China relations shows that the US is still in a much more imposing diplomatic and militaristic position than the inverse. Look at this recent slew of stories covered on most of the major outlets about America's presence in the South China Sea.
It's here in the Western Pacific where America's naval power is on full display. The USS Nimitz with more than 60 planes and 5,000 sailors. Guam is where we took off from this morning. It is considered the tip of the spear, one part of the Marianas, a strategic location used during World War II to launch the bombs that forced Japan to surrender.
I wonder why they made sure to mention that. I'm sure that has nothing to do with rising tensions.
His military soon makes its presence known.
We're over the South China Sea, and that is a Chinese J-11 fighter, and he's flying right beside us.
This is a close encounter with a Chinese warplane, filmed just off the wing of a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane flying over the South China Sea.
We're getting a close-up look at a Chinese fighter jet. The aircrew here identifies it as a J-11.
I'd say it's another Friday afternoon, South China Sea.
Wow, good one. But seriously, with this totally not coordinated media tour, where like half of the American press corps was on the same military plane just a couple hundred feet away from Chinese airspace, you have to ask yourself who's really the imposing power here. I mean, just take a look at what politicians and military members are saying about America's presence in the South China Sea.
And I do think that the Chinese now understand that the United States is staying in this region. We're the leader in this region.
I'll tell you this, we are here to stay, right, in the South China Sea and in this part of the world. And I think that's the message that we really want to convey to not only China, but the entire world.
Are you sure? This aside, the media pushes decoupling as a necessary measure in preventing future impositions from China and maintaining America's economic sovereignty. One argument often brought up about decoupling is that China needs American trade just as much as America needs theirs, and that they need to play by America's rules if they want to avoid an economic catastrophe. Just take a look at how this is usually discussed.
They are unbelievably dependent on exports, both to the United States and to the European Union. They would be testing our willingness to take a lot of pain in order to punish them. It's a very weird call.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. That's because you made that point up. In truth, the method of decoupling both wouldn't be as effective in hurting China as its proponents seem to think, and it would actually hurt Americans significantly. See, ever since the early 2000s, the share of the Chinese economy that comes from exports to the US has steadily declined, and now account for just about 2% of China's total GDP. While a theoretical total loss of this would of course have a negative impact on China's economy, it wouldn't be the shattering force that many of China's critics in America seem to think it would be. I have a hard time believing that those pushing for decoupling are unaware of this. And if they know it wouldn't actually accomplish their goals of significantly hampering the Chinese economy, then why are they pushing for it? Well, frankly put, there's two main reasons why this is being pushed. First, this is a reaction against not just the increasing importance of China in the American economy, but of China's rise on the global stage. China has begun to exert itself as an economic and political leader in the world, and has surpassed the US in many regions like Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America as a preferred economic partner. Decoupling is largely a signal of concern over this economic expansion, and the hope is that divestment followed by sanctioning would disincentivize countries from dealing with China over the US. Second, and perhaps even more importantly, it's a measure that would work in the benefit of one very specific group in America. See, it's not the American people that would see the benefits from cutting off China, but American business interests. The reason why American liberals push less for total decoupling is because they are more likely to see the utility in globalist policies. In the past, the hope of Western countries was that by incorporating China into the world market and political system, it would effectively cause a bloodless counter-revolution that would reinstall capitalist governance in China. Just take a listen.
Absolutely. They don't play by any of the rules. Understand this, that we allowed them to basically do anything they wanted. We opened up our markets and say Chinese companies can do whatever they want in America, but we allowed them to restrict us over there. And we did it under this theory that when they got rich, they'd become just like us. Well, they got rich, and they're not like us.
No.
And they don't share our values. They don't share our commitment to playing by the rules.
Instead, China experienced a massive rise in its economic forces that brought the Communist Party of China unmatched favorability within its borders.
And nobody is more a victim of the Chinese Communist Party than the Chinese people.
In recent years, Xi Jinping has been developing a model for 21st century socialism in China, effectively ending the belief that China would liberalize. With the failure of this model of integration, even liberals have begun to veer right on issues related to China, and the right's model for dealing with China falls more into classical diplomatic methods of exclusion, sanctioning, and so on. Overall, the American right's model towards foreign economic relations is one that acts in favor of domestic capital, industrialists, corporations, whatever your preferred term. This group, the same that literally owns the media, has a very simple desire: to make money and protect their assets that allow them to make money. While more liberal members of this class are those that push neoliberal policies that further the process of globalization, the conservative members, usually domestic industrialists, typically fund American isolationist policies. The reason why this group pushes for complete decoupling is because they want license to bring back manufacturing to the United States. Or at least, this is what they say, but I'll get back to this in just a sec. For both groups, the goal is to make as large of a profit as possible while also ensuring the survival of the means to make profit. Even if the stated goal is to bring back production to the US, this simply won't happen. And this is exactly where the evidence already points. See, I've sort of hid one thing from you. The push for decoupling is not some theoretical policy position. It's a process which has already started. Well, sort of. To say decoupling has started is also a bit of a misunderstanding. What I mean to say is that some American corporations have already begun to move their production from China to other countries and regions, such as India and Southeast Asia. This isn't necessarily because of the national security or ideological reasons presented previously, but simply because it's becoming more expensive to produce in China. When American businesses began to flood into the country, the costs were insanely low. The cost of labor was much lower than it was in the US, and this is exactly what these companies wanted. Since then, however, the cost of labor has risen, and the Chinese government has continually improved working conditions and labor rights through policy since this period. As the standard of living in China has increased, it's become harder and harder to make the large profit margins companies previously could. And as a result, they've already begun the process of moving their investments to states where labor rights, wages, and regulations are lower so that they can continue making huge sums of money. So, if the ones that stand to benefit from decoupling are both international and American domestic companies, both of whom have competing desires and methods, what would decoupling actually look like? Well, not to ruin the party, but America wouldn't see this glorious revival of industry that would revive America's international standing and economic power. That era is long gone, and it needs to be evident to any American that hopes their lives will become better if we just brought back industry, are ignoring the larger matter at hand. That those with power and money don't care about them. They only care about themselves and their way of life and the means to maintain that way of life. What we would see is likely just the transfer of industry to lesser developed states in order to exploit their cheaper labor, resources, and lack of workers' guarantees and environmental regulations. Don't listen to these talking heads telling you that decoupling would make you or your life better, because frankly, it would do the opposite. The impact of this on Americans would be detrimental, just as it would be for those in developing states that would be subject to this industrial shock treatment their countries would face. Americans would be footing the bill for the loss of industrial output that the current dynamic with China allows. But don't take my word for it, just take a listen to what the media is already telling us will happen.
We have to, as we did last night, lay out to the American people what the threat is and what's necessary to make sure that the Chinese don't overtake the United States in the world economy. And when they do that, they will look to displace us. It's not just competition, it is them being our adversary. And we have to communicate to the American people that this is going to take some tough decisions. It is going to take some sacrifice. It's not going to all be an easy path. But I think if we communicate to the American people, I think they are ready to make that sacrifice, because they know if they don't, the outcome will not be good for the United States in the long run.
No, you're right about that, and you articulated it very well, Congressman.
See, you're willing to make that sacrifice. At least that's what they think. All Americans would see in the short term, besides the political consequences this would have with China, would be more expensive goods and shortages. The sort of thing we just spent over 2 years getting past, while the transition to set up industrial infrastructures in other countries is underway. On top of this, it would likely be the American people's tax dollars being used to help ease this transition for companies. Overall, like with virtually every other policy made by the US government, it's working class Americans getting cheated and robbed. And as always, the media is selling it as if it's the solution to all of America's woes. So this being said, what's the takeaway here? See, while this is all focused on a concerted media campaign for one specific policy towards China, this is just one small piece in a very large picture about this new Cold War. This story largely singles out civilian and business elements and ignores the entire government and military campaign against China. I chose to cover this one topic because it gives insight into how the media can manipulate the public into favorability to policies that are against their own well-being for self-benefit. But this issue is much larger than just the media, and the media often works hand in hand with the actual political power structure in America, which is something that absolutely has to be recognized. We need to take a firm stance of de-escalation and normalization between the two countries, or else the consequences could be completely catastrophic. At the end of the day, you have nothing to gain and everything to lose if the US provokes a war with China. Just take a look at what the chair of the House Committee on China has to say about this possibility.
This thing really escalated into a conflict between our navies. That would entail a level of destruction and death that we haven't seen for a long, long time.
And he's right, which is why him and his friends need to put an end to these stunts as soon as possible. I'll be covering the political and military issues between the US and China in the future, seeing as how each day there seems to be increasing provocations, but that's all for now. Peaceful relations and mutually beneficial development are all things that we need to seek as a world going forward, and we need to be against those that would escalate tensions for their own benefit. Well, that's all for this video. This one took much longer to make, just because I wanted to make sure I learned a bit more about editing before I went ahead and recorded a longer video. So I hope you liked it. Please go ahead and subscribe, like the video, let me know how this one matched up to the previous two, and I hope to have another one out soon. Thanks for watching.
Titled The Threat That Communist Chinese Party